Hello and welcome to another episode of Study Sessions, the revision podcast from St. George's. Today we're focused on William Golding's Lord of the Flies, but more specifically on week 11's question, which is, how does Golding present the boy's loss of innocence on the island? So this episode is going to be thinking about how this harrowing tale of schoolboys stranded on an uninhabited island begins with playful hope and optimism, and as we well know, descends into chaos. So we're going to be tracking that journey from a naive childhood innocence to a disturbing recognition of humanity's darker instincts. We're also going to be drawing on a number of different critical interpretations collected by the literary critic Harold Bloom. And so this is going to allow us to unpack how that transformation that I've just mentioned reflects deeper philosophical and moral questions about human nature. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be looking at several key quotations to guide our discussion, and I really want to make sure these are quotations that find their way into your homework. The purpose of including these quotations is obviously to root our analysis in specific textual reference, but also to highlight how Golding portrays innocence's fragility and obviously how painfully eroded and ultimately destroyed innocence is by the end of the novel. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. Before we look at the novel specifically and we start working through a series of key moments and key quotations, we've encountered this word innocence, and it's very important in academic writing, in essay writing, that we really understand our terms, and we need to really have a clear understanding of what do we mean by the word innocence. It's a word that has a number of somewhat different definitions and meanings. Obviously, they're related. And so I just want to work through these very quickly because we want to hold all of them in our minds simultaneously, because innocence is multifaceted. It's not just one thing. So the first definition is the state of being unsullied or stained by sin or moral wrong, lacking a knowledge of evil. So that lack of sin, of not committing sins, of not engaging in immoral activity, but also lacking a knowledge of evil, so not even conceiving or thinking of evil actions. That poses some interesting questions, doesn't it, for Lord of the Flies and the question of innate evil. The next definition is the quality of innocent naivety. So this is the idea of being so kind of young and inexperienced that you lack the adult experience that would therefore make you less innocent. A sort of innocence as an ignorance of how the world really works. I'm already beginning to think about the character of Ralph in terms of naivety. He has a rather naive attitude, I think, about human beings and about human interactions, something we'll look at later on over the course of this episode. And then the final one is the final definition, a state or condition of being innocent of a specific crime or offense. Now, if we're thinking of crimes, of serious wrongdoing in the novel, there are a number of key moments that stand out. The pinnacle of wrongdoing really is the communal murder of Simon, something, again, I'll talk about later in this episode. But also we need to be thinking about the way in which the playful attack, kind of play fighting, involving Robert pretending to be the pig, the way that gets out of hand, the burning of the island, the way that the signal fire gets out of hand very early on, and the boy with the birthmark is probably killed, the violent and sadistic sexualized killing of the sow. There are lots of crimes which the boys, to varying degrees, are culpable of. So again, by going back to these definitions, by thinking about innocence in a really rich and nuanced and subtle way, we can start thinking about how Golding touches on each of these different kind of meanings of the word and explores them with some rather serious questions about human morality and human nature. So we've defined our term, really important, innocence. Free from sin, free from the knowledge of sin. It also captures a sense of innocent naivety, a lack of experience that we would associate with childhood. And then the final one, the focus on innocence as innocent of a crime or specific wrongdoing. So we've got those three meanings in our mind as we work through the novel. So let's start at the beginning. The boys land on the island. When they first land on the island, there's this incredible sense of excitement. There's a real sense of excitement in chapter 1. So the absence of adults is initially viewed by the boys as liberation, freedom. Okay, we can have fun because there's no adults around. And I think Ralph's really jubilant exclamation captures this mood of excitement and perhaps a mood of possibility. He just, in chapter 1, goes, "No grown-ups!" exclamation mark. Okay, kind of relishing the lack of adult supervision. Now, the critic Harold Bloom identifies this moment, something maybe we can overlook, maybe even a quotation we can overlook. Bloom identifies this moment as symptomatic of or emblematic of the boys' initial belief in the kind of purity of childhood. It's a world that's going to be free from the impositions of authority and societal expectation. And that seems, to begin with, something to celebrate, seems to be a source of joy. On top of that, the generally idyllic description of the island serves as a kind of Edenic backdrop to what's going on, sort of untouched paradise. However, okay, there's a problem. The scar, okay, that's a quotation, the scar left by the plane crash foreshadows the destructive impact that the boys are going to have over the course of the novel. The joyous tone of that exclamation masks a deeper irony. Without grown-ups, so it might be a source of joy to begin with, but without grown-ups, the boys are also without the kind of moral structures that safeguard innocence. And so in this moment, I think Golding is therefore highlighting how easily innocence can be threatened and damaged when it's left unprotected. Although, to add another further complication, we shouldn't be drawn into that too much because there's no innocence off the island either. Think about the backdrop to this novel, why the boys are on the island in the first place. We've basically got nuclear apocalypse. The boys have been kind of fleeing from that. So it isn't as if innocence exists off the island either. If we need adults to safeguard innocence, at the same time, adults haven't really been safeguarding innocence off the island. They've been, destroying one another in a kind of nuclear apocalypse. So that does then beg the question, is innocence in our world even truly possible? Or at least, can we ever hope as human beings to maintain any sense of innocence or purity? At the beginning of the novel too, the boys' innocence is really evident in their approach to democracy and the way they try to govern themselves. The act of voting is described as a toy. The full quote is, quote, "This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch." This is a quotation, I think, that reveals the boys' initial naivety, a lack of knowledge, lack of experience, lack of understanding. They view the process of establishing order as a game, a toy, something childlike to be played with. And that really serves to reinforce and underscore their childlike innocence. Of course, they are children. However, as Jack's hunger for power grows over the course of the book, this is an innocence that fades, is eroded, and those democratic ideals represented in part by the toy of voting are ultimately abandoned. Golding, I think, uses this early scene, this early moment to foreshadow how the boys' attempts at maintaining democratic structures are ultimately doomed to failure, and therefore that leads to link it back to the terms of the question, leads to the erosion of their innocence. On top of that, and we've just mentioned that it was almost as pleasing as the conch in the quotation, the conch is critical to our understanding of innocence and, of course, order and civilization and democracy. Any essay dealing with innocence has to deal with the conch as a crucial, symbolic, allegorically important object in the novel. So Golding introduces the conch, the huge shell, as a really powerful symbol of order and civility. At first, the boys respect it. They treat it gently and so on. They gather for meetings when it's blown. They adhere to the authority of the conch, taking it in turns, all those sorts of things. Ralph's leadership is inextricably linked to the conch. Most obscurely, there was the conch. It's one of the reasons, slightly strangely, that Ralph is actually elected as chief, elected as leader, in addition to his kind of physical appearance, but it's actually the fact he's holding this object. The boys are drawn to it. They recognize its power. They recognize, particularly Piggy recognizes, just how precious and vital this object is, and therefore how precious and vital the ideas are that are represented by the conch symbolically. So Ralph's leadership is so closely linked to the conch, and I think it's really reflective of their attempt to try to replicate the societal norms through the sort of prism, through a very sort of childlike perspective. They're trying to replicate the sorts of societal and democratic structures that they knew about and had experienced in their old life pre-island. But also there's a tension, and there's a real tension between order and innocence and chaos and destruction. And this is captured beautifully when Jack asserts, quote, "We've got to have rules and obey them. After all, we're not savages, we're English, and the English are best at everything." Now, lots going on here in this relatively short quotation. It's very interesting that Golding puts these words in the mouth of Jack, because obviously then that raises a whole series of kind of ironic questions about, of all of the boys, who ends up acting most savagely? It's probably Jack, okay? So we've got to have rules and obey them. After all, we're not savages. We're English, and the English are best at everything. Now, Harold Bloom's analysis of this reveals just how kind of dripping in irony this statement is, but there's also some colonial and almost imperial undertones going on in this statement. Let me explain what I mean. This invocation, this incredibly confident, hubristic invocation of English superiority echoes the kind of Victorian confidence that, in Englishness, if you will, that Golding is in part critiquing in this book. This is a belief in civility that actually seems to be masking. It's a kind of thin veneer, which is actually masking the boys' vulnerability to savagery. There's nothing about the English that somehow protects them or insulates them from the savagery and the inherent evil and violence that is a human capacity. It's nothing to do with savages. It isn't any sense that the English are actually the best at anything. Don't forget as well that this book is in part a response, or is written as a response to the rather complacent and, I would say, naively hubristic confidence in kind of English boys that we see in the novel The Coral Island, which Golding read to his children and felt that it's entirely inauthentic if you happen to know children at all, and if you know human beings at all. So to go back to the conch then, and this idea of rules and obeying the rules, and the idea as well that the English are somehow specifically well placed because of their Englishness to somehow avoid degenerating into savagery, it's a load of nonsense. And we see that sort of through the conch. The conch, which is initially a tool to preserve and maintain and defend innocence and democratic structures and fairness, becomes absolutely powerless as the boys abandon those principles. The fragility of innocence itself is, of course, symbolized by the conch's ultimate destruction, a moment of destruction that takes place when Piggy himself is killed. The rock struck Piggy a glancing blow from chin to knee. The conch exploded into 1,000 white fragments and ceased to exist. Cease to exist. It's not just that it's broken or damaged. It ceases to exist. It is utterly obliterated. And so Golding, I think, here is emphasizing how innocence, just like the conch, the object that symbolizes it, is delicate, it's precious, it's fragile, but crucially, it cannot withstand the force of unchecked savagery. Once the conch is destroyed, and of course, at the same time, Piggy is dead. So once the conch is destroyed and Piggy is dead, the boys lose that last symbol of unity, and innocence is irreparably shattered and obliterated. But if we're talking about characters that are related to innocence, we've got to think too about the character of Simon. Simon's character stands apart from all of the other characters in the novel, even Piggy and certainly Ralph too, as a symbol of innate innocence and moral clarity and moral purity. His kindness, such as when he helps the little ones gather the choicest fruit, really serves and also helps Ralph with the building of shelters, serves to underscore his purity. Don't forget too, and again, it's really easy to overlook these things, Simon's reaction to the island's beauty reflects his profound connection to nature, and therefore this almost kind of Edenic, or we might say prelapsarian, pre our expulsion from the Garden of Eden sort of situation as human beings. Simon retains that moral purity and innocence that the other boys simply do not have. Let's think about this quotation. Quote, "The candle buds," which of course Simon recognizes that they are candle buds, "the candle buds opened their wide white flowers, glimmering under the light that pricked down from the first stars." This moment, this focus on the candle buds, bearing in mind, Ralph says when he sees these plants, goes, "Oh, we can't eat them." Okay, representing something of Ralph's limited philosophical insights, rather pragmatic. You can either eat it or you can't. If you can't eat it, well, what's its value? Simon sensitively recognizes their beauty and understands them and having value because of their beauty. And of course, Jack slashes at them with his knife if we needed more understanding of what Jack's really all about. But I think this moment with the candle buds highlights, if we're thinking of Simon, his unique ability on the island to see beauty and peace where other boys only see resources to exploit and to use. The critic Harold Bloom notes actually that Simon's communion, his close connection and link with nature, could symbolize this untainted, or to go back to that definition of innocence, unsullied nature. He's untouched by the fears, the desires, the ambitions, the savagery that is consuming the others. And yet, Simon's tragic death at the hands of his peers signifies the ultimate destruction, just like the destruction of the conch, the ultimate destruction of innocence. Golding is using Simon to show how purity and understanding are often utterly crushed in the face of collective ignorance, savagery, violence, but also, crucially, fear. And we can turn now to that turning point, that watershed moment, that pivotal moment in the novel, which is, of course, Simon's brutal death. This is a moment that we can think of as a ritualistic enactment or reenactment of our capacity as humans for collective, communal, group violence. It's a moment that is foreshadowed in the sadistic, strangely, perversely sexualized killing of the sow, the kind of horrible moment where Roger kills the sow, or inflicts actually kind of painful torture. He doesn't even kill the sow when he's brutalizing the sow in the way that he does. The kind of relish, the sadistic sexualized pleasure Roger and also, crucially, Jack find in the killing of the sow. You know, this is not killing for the practical purpose of getting meat. It's killing for delight and pleasure in violence, and more on that later in terms of Roger. But if we're thinking about that killing of Simon, quite a lot of critics interpret Simon as a sort of Christ-like figure. He does have elements of, obviously, we're not going to say something as limited and simplistic as saying, oh, you know, Simon is Jesus. That's way too simplistic and reductive. But he does have Christ-like qualities of purity. He does have moral insight. He does have care for others, particularly the moment passing down the choicest fruit. But even the way that he goes to help Piggy when his glasses are damaged, the way that he defends Piggy, he helped that way. The reassurance he provides Ralph, you know, you'll get back. Those sorts of moments do have a Christ-like quality, and therefore it makes his murder all the more chilling, not just for its violence, but also for that communal nature. You know, it implicates even the more supposedly, in inverted commas, innocent boys. Ralph and Piggy are intimately involved in the killing of Simon. And then the chapter after the killing of Simon, Piggy is reluctant to acknowledge his moral implication in the killing of Simon. Ralph does, to be fair to him, I mean, he's involved in it, so I don't want to be too fair to him, but Ralph does reflect on the event, and in that reflection, he captures its gravity, its seriousness. He says that was murder. So for Ralph to articulate that word, murder, is to really confront, to be brought face to face with the disintegration of innocence and the inescapable darkness that resides within all of us. This is part of Ralph's journey, painful, traumatic journey from a very naive faith in human goodness and kind of childlike innocence to a horrible, traumatized, much more adult recognition of what human beings are truly capable of. Don't forget as well that that frenzied dance which leads up to Simon's death reflects what Harold Bloom, the critic, describes as a regression, a kind of going backwards to primitive, primordial savagery. There's something deeply animal and primitive about that dancing, which is so unsettling for us as readers, bearing in mind, of course, that this is, English boys. The English are best at everything, seemingly not. So Golding is emphasizing that innocence isn't just merely lost in that moment of violence, but is also eroded by things like fear and superstition, this utterly superstitious and irrational fear of a non-existent beast. Who does realize the nature of the beast, the true nature of the beast? Of course, it's Simon. Maybe there is a beast. Maybe it's only us. Don't forget, too, that when Simon thinks of the beast, the image of a human appears in front of him, both heroic, yes, okay, are good qualities, but also sick, okay, stained by the disease of sin and evil. Simon's tragic attempt to reveal the truth about the beast ends with him becoming the scapegoat for those internalized fears of the beast and marking, another death of innocence among them. So if we talk about the death of innocence, we also need to think about Jack and Roger. Now, Jack's descent into savagery and his loss of innocence, if there was any innocence there to begin with, I don't think there is. But Jack's descent begins with that obsession, that focus on hunting, over and above the focus on building shelters, building huts, maintaining the signal fire, focusing on rescue. That's of no interest to Jack at all. And so his transformation is this transformation into a sort of primal, primitive, animalistic, bestial sort of figure. And we've got this great quotation, quote, "The mask was a thing on its own, behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness." At the start of the episode, I mentioned no grown-ups, that liberation from the authority and rules that are symbolized by the word grown-ups and that idea of the grown-up. But this actual liberation here marks Jack's rejection of innocence. The mask of face painting allows him to act without any kind of moral restraint. He can transgress, he can sin without limitation. Roger, on the other hand, embodies a more, I think, calculated form of malice. There's something about Roger that I find in that way more unsettling than even Jack. His casual attitude towards violence, his relish in violence for violence's sake. You can say that Jack engages in violence for some sadistic pleasure, but most violence Jack engages in is related to kind of power and leadership and authority, in some senses ambition to be chief, to be leader. Roger, it's all about sadism, I think. He is comfortable with violence, and that is, of course, epitomized most when he deliberately kills Piggy. Quote, "Roger, with a sense of delirious abandonment, leaned all his weight on the lever." Now, that moment of him levering off the boulder is, of course, foreshadowed earlier in the novel by the stone-throwing incident where he throws to miss. His arm, we learn, is conditioned by a civilization that knew nothing of him, a civilization that was also, we learn, in ruins, the ruins of nuclear apocalypse and destruction. But that delirious abandonment, that total sense of a loss of self, of pleasure, of sadistic pleasure, reaches its zenith, its high point, its apotheosis, we could say, in the killing of Piggy. So I think really in this moment we can interpret Roger's actions as the epitome of unchecked savagery and calculated violence. But unlike Jack, whose violence, as I've just said, tends to stem from sort of passion and dominance, Roger's cruelty increasingly over the course of the book becomes cold, becomes more and more methodical. But both characters illustrate how innocence isn't only lost, but also actively destroyed through the embrace of power and violence. Golding contrasts this embrace of power and violence with Ralph's internal struggle to retain some semblance of civility, civilization, decency, and therefore that highlights the moral chasm, the huge gap that separates Ralph on one hand, Simon, Piggy, and Roger and Jack on the other. Now we come to the end of the book, the novel's conclusion, and this moment of reflection, and also this keyword grief. Okay, we're going to be talking about grief and its relationship with innocence. So by the end of the book, Ralph is literally a hunted figure. The last remnants and vestiges of reason gone. All that's left, Simon's gone, Piggy's gone. All that's left is Ralph. He's the last vestige, if there is any, of reason amid this tyrannical rule of Jack and also increasingly Roger. The arrival at the end of the naval officer, at least momentarily, restores order. I mean, on a practical level, it seems to save Ralph's life. But Ralph's reaction is far from a celebration, okay? Or even like, oh, phew, I'm not going to have my head cut off and stuck on the pointed end of a stick. He feels grief. And this is really, really emotively and poignantly expressed. Listen to this quotation. Quote, "Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy." This is a moment that encapsulates Golding's ultimate message and commentary on innocence itself. Ralph's tears aren't just for Piggy. They're for the loss of his childhood idealism and his traumatized recognition of humanity's inherent flaws, particularly our capacity, our seemingly innate natural capacity for violence and evil. So the naval officer's presence underscores that point, because his uniformed civility, he's there with his epaulets and all of that, actually masks the ongoing violence of the adult world. That trim cruiser in the distance, a symbol of the adult violence going on off the island, okay? Golding leaves us then with a really uncomfortable truth that innocence, once it's lost, can't be reclaimed, and that these cycles of violence and savagery are going to continue. Why? Because they are part of who we are as a species. So to conclude, Lord of the Flies is, as you well know, far more than just a story of some boys on an island. It's a really chilling exploration of innocence, morality, and just how thin that facade or veneer of civilization is. So as the critic Harold Bloom notes, the novel ultimately, probably more than anything, forces us to confront some very uncomfortable truths about human nature and the fragility of our social order. So Golding challenges us to ask a really lofty, important, and perhaps maybe unanswerable question. Are we as civilized as we truly believe? As always, thank you so much for joining me today for today's episode of Study Sessions, otherwise known informally as the Baughcast. Please make sure that you follow. Please make sure that you leave reviews, obviously positive reviews. It really, really pushes this podcast way beyond the narrow confines of St. George's. And also make sure that you hit the notification bell so that you are notified as new episodes come out. As always, I hope this has been really helpful too. Make sure that you're listening to this in conjunction with all the help that your teacher will be giving you around this homework on Google Classroom and so on, and in class, so you can do a fantastic job that you can then hopefully replicate in the exam hall come your real exam. Okay, best of luck. Thank you so much.